안녕하십니까. Good morning. Thank you for joining us early in the morning. Today, I have the pleasure of introducing our speaker this morning, Dr. Jonathan Water, who will share his thoughts about automation, jobs, and the future of work in Korea. This is a very timely and relevant topic, as you know. And there have been many, because many of us are concerned about the potential impact of automation and artificial intelligence on our jobs and the world of work. Of course, there are many studies that have done on this topic, and some studies say as many as up to 50% of our jobs will be displaced. And some other studies say, no, that's too much. Only 9% of the jobs will be displaced. And how many and at what percentage? Well, that remains to be seen. With that, I'd like to make a brief introduction of Dr. Jonathan Water, who is a director and senior partner of McKinsey Global Institute, which is McKinsey's business and economics research arm. In his capacity as a director of the McKinsey Global Institute, he leads numerous research efforts, especially on global economic trends, including growth, productivity, urbanization, affordable housing, e-commerce, energy policy and sustainability, and of course the economic impact of the internet and economic development. And Dr. Water has advised many national governments in Asia and in China, especially for improving the environment for foreign investors, national energy policy, and economic development strategies. And based in China since 1985, Dr. Water has done a lot of work on China, with China, and in China. For instance, he has been involved in many projects throughout China with regional authorities, having conducted more than 60 projects on economic development strategies and transformations. And he also co-chairs a non-profit think tank, China Urban Initiatives, a joint venture, which is a joint venture of Columbia University, Tsinghua University, and McKinsey, to develop and implement economic development strategies, and of course to address China's urbanization questions. Dr. Water also has written a number of books. He co-authored a book in 2015 called No Ordinary Disruption, The 4 Global Forces Breaking All the Trends, which was translated, in fact, into Korean last year, right? As Speed of the Future. In Korean, it's 미래의 속도. And some of you may recall, he joined us in our international conference on the Fourth Industrial Revolution and the future of the Korean economy that was held October last year. We thank you again for your participation. Well, I can go on, and I don't think I have done enough justice to his brilliant career, but for the time's sake, I better stop here and invite Dr. Water and see what he has to say about automation, jobs, and the future of work in Korea. Dr. Water? Can we give him a round of applause?
Thank you very much, Kyung-jin, Dr. Sungin. I appreciate the chance to always come to Seoul to spend time in one of the world's great cities. You might have been wondering what is the unifying theme around my research. It was a very kind introduction. It's two things, really. It's China, of course. So I'm happy that today is a blue skies day. You're getting the best of China, so as opposed to the other days. Sorry about that. The other part of my career is around cities and urbanization. And urbanization is one of those things where it can mean almost anything. Because in the words of Esther Fuchs from Columbia University, told me once, the city is life. You know, it's what we do. It's everything. It's where we work. It's how we live. It's how we communicate. It's where we develop technology. It's where we use the technology. It's how we travel. So when I say I'm an urbanization person or an urbanist, that doesn't really mean anything. Then I'm just interested in everything that happens in a city. So it's a great way of having a specialty because I can use it to talk about anything. So today I was asked what could we say from the McKinsey Global Institute as a critical and an important contribution to thinking about the economy for Korea and societies. And from that, I was asked, from our research, I think the most important topic is this question of automation, of technology, and how it affects our work life, and with that, how it affects our society. Because we think we're at one of those moments, and perhaps we'll have many more, but it's a turning point. It's as they say, a no ordinary disruption. We've had this before, of course. We should note that just as we used to have an agricultural society, and in Korea that was not so long ago, maybe 80, 90 years ago. And now today, of course, very few people work in agriculture. That's going to happen again. But think about what changed when we moved from an agricultural to an industrial society anywhere in the world. Sometimes it went well, sometimes it was very chaotic. Some people said that transition resulted at least in the American Civil War, possibly is responsible for World War I. Possibly it even had something to do with World War II. So this transition, when we all decide that we're going to change our jobs from being farmers to being industrialists, and if it happens again, this might have some really big implications. Now it can go well, of course, and there are lots of things that improved when we did the last big transition. We got public health. We got workers' rights. We got public education. All these things didn't exist in an agricultural society, and they came to exist in an industrial society because they were needed. We had a new set of workers. We had a new set of worker requirements. They needed new things. And either they were going to get them or there was going to be trouble. So we found a way of doing these things. We found a way of providing new skills to the workers and new ways of supporting their families, the ones who were not working, and of providing new places for them to live on land which they didn't have before. All these things came to be relatively quickly. And that, I think, is where we are today. We're going to have to find new ways of providing skills to workers, of providing resources for their families, of providing land and buildings and housing for everybody, because the workplace of the future is changing. So that's why I think it's a really important topic. And we'll take you through the most recent McKinsey Global Institute research on what's changing, and importantly, how it's changing and who it's changing who it is happening to. And then perhaps we can have a couple of questions and conversation about the implications for Korea. And now, in the spirit of using the technology, I'm going to need someone to turn this on. There you go. Great. Thanks. So, step back. This is actually, first of all, we should realize that all of this change is basically a good thing. That we are living in an unprecedented period of prosperity, and we have been for the last 50 or 60 years. That historically GDP grew at, well, if we take it back before 1800, at less than 1%. And from the 1700s onwards, it grew at about 1%. And then starting in the 1940s, it started to grow at 2%. And even higher, actually, if you take it from the 50s, it looks more like 3%. So this is a really, really good time. And that has created a whole lot of opportunity. Literacy has been going up dramatically. Wages have risen on average 8 times. People living below poverty has dropped. And this is, of course, a huge China factor. Life expectancy is growing by 20 or 30 years. The world is a much less violent place. You know, reading the news and listening to some of our politicians, you might not think this, but actually, you know, everything that kills us is down. The homicide rate, the public health problems, the war and violence, actually. Again, on a per capita basis, we're growing, so there's bigger problems, but on a per capita basis, it's down. And even in environmental areas, so once environmental problems are identified, they're actually addressed. If you talk to Al Gore these days, he's a very happy guy. He would say that we're already past the turning point where people realize that you can grow the economy without growing the carbon. That these things can be separated. And we start to see that in many industries and countries. So this is actually basically a really positive moment. But this is let's just keep that in the back of your head as we go through this, because it's important to keep the optimism. I want to start with the optimism, because the rest of it may lead us to forget some of the positive parts. What's driving all of that change? Let's just basically say it's technology, it's or innovation, or in econometrics, it's total factor productivity. It's the residual. It's what's left over after we account for increases in investments and demographic changes and resource inputs. What's left over is how well we use all of that resource and that investment and that savings. And that number is going up. This is just looking at the US and the UK, but if you sort of take the idea that developed countries show the way for developing, then it goes from 10% of total growth to 40, 50, 60, 70, 80%. So basically it's a productivity story saying that, and this is another set of McKinsey research showing that whereas in the past a lot of that growth would have come from demographics and people having more kids, over the last 30, 40 years, the percentage of that growth that comes from the demographics, particularly in advanced economies, is dropping dramatically, and going forward will be basically zero. So that the world is aging really fast, and as a result, we're not going to expect much increases in the working population. So it's all about productivity, which is really a function of technology very broadly defined. So when we say tech, we don't just mean the internet, though that's certainly part. It's non-digital technologies. It's how we use, again, the machines that we have. It's energy. It's gene sequencing. There's so many good examples, but the one I like is the home DNA sequencer. You can buy a machine now for $100,000, which will sequence your DNA at home. for about 2,000 or 3,000. I'm sure many people in this room have done this through a commercial service to find out where they came from and their backgrounds and all of their genetic markers. That $100,000 machine replaces a project called the Human Genome Project, which cost the equivalent of the Panama Canal not more than 15 or 20 years ago. So we went from something that cost tens of billions of dollars to something that costs $100,000 to do the same thing within 10 years. So that's productivity. That's what we mean by the opportunity to drive growth. You can do the same thing hundreds of thousands of times better and faster and cheaper. So this is just getting faster. This chart is from Ray Kurzweil. Some people know the singularity concept, which is, and here it maps the number of calculations per second per $1,000. In other words, if you're going to spend money on processing, this is what you get. How fast, how much processing capacity, how fast can you go for $1,000? And you can see the line that, it is, these are different computers. Back in the 1900s, it's a log scale, so it's like exponential. You can see that it kind of climbs up there. So it gets, it starts to look like, we will have the ability to produce machines which can calculate at the same pace of all human brains by the year 2050. That, this is a exponential growth factor as AI gets better and better. Everything becoming faster, smaller, cheaper, and better. The point is that it's not just one thing as well, it's a combination of things. As technology progresses, it allows us to do more things across disciplines. So if we look at what's in a phone, it's the glass, but it's also the application, and it's the processing power within the application. It's the display, it's the connectivity, it's the battery. All these things are separate technologies brought together to enable new capacities. And because technology in an object proceeds at the pace of the slowest link, as we connect more things, we get faster technologies. They are able to switch the bottleneck moves quite quickly. Whether we're talking about electric and autonomous vehicles or phones or new ways of extending life and preventing diseases. One more thing, it's not just about people, of course, and how we use things. It's about the devices themselves. And this is a fundamental change in what's being revolutionized. So that we'll have as 3 times as many connected devices as people by 2020. And that's just a reality. We're going to have more issues related to the connection of things than we are the connection of people. Whether it's about distributed denial of service attacks and somebody turning your toaster on from somewhere else, or it's about how you can make sure your kids are safe when they're on the other side of the world. These are things that, the connected IoT capability is creating the opportunity for. So, and finally, we're going to continue to expand these things. So if we talk about mobility, often we sort of think about the car, but think about this, your electric vehicle is also your largest battery. So by having electric vehicles, you can store energy, which means you don't have to build new power plants, and you can use that energy for recharging other things. And essentially it changes the utility model. The utility will no longer have revenues from selling kilowatt hours. We'll have the same amount of kilowatt hours, it'll just be spread out everywhere. So the utility has to become a different kind of business. It obviously changes public transit. It changes buildings. One of the most exciting things I've heard of in the building area is unconnected buildings. Buildings which do not need to be connected to the grid of any kind. They do not need electricity connections. They do not need water connections. They do not need sewage connections. Everything can be recycled from the air, from the ground, from within the building, and it can be printed out. So imagine that. your vacation home will be a 3D printed house, which you can drop on the top of the nearest mountain, and you can commute to this through your autonomous electric flying vehicle. The physical world will be very different in the future. So let's talk about this specific issue of jobs and AI. Basically, we think AI is getting to the point where you've got two things going on that are two broad things that are basically creating this tipping point. The first is the technology itself. We've got breakthroughs in the core computing technology and the CPU speed and the ability to, whether it's quantum computing or it's just the nanotechnology technology at the nanoscale. We've got a lot more computing power than we ever had. Secondly, algorithms and the ability to learn, and self-learning algorithms are finally, after decades, starting to actually pay off. It's not just about chess and Go, though that's kind of a marker, but it's the ability to learn across all sorts of cognitive fields. And finally, it's data set. We have a lot more data than we ever had, and it's growing again because of the connection of devices. So because we have so much more things that are connected, that creates an explosion in the amount of data, which in turn makes the algorithm better. The algorithm becomes more accurate, if you will. So that's on that. And then we have adoption. Adoption is about the applications, then sort of whether or not we have the thing that can be useful, whether it's in credit scoring for banks, or it's for customer service and marketing personnel, or it's in training videos and for automotive workers. I think a lot more applications. And finally, we have use cases. We have companies that are using these things in a much more aggressive way, and particularly smaller companies and startup companies. Those are the drivers. We asked ourselves, so how do we think about how that affects people? And we basically broke it down into these fundamental sort of capabilities. What we need to understand is for every job has a bunch of activities, and every activity has a bunch of capabilities. And so when we get to answer the question that Dr. Sung mentioned, is that how many people are being disrupted or how many jobs are being disrupted, we thought it was not accurate enough to just talk about a job. What we need to talk about is the content of that job. What is that job, and in order to understand, will that job still be there, or will it even be the same job? So to understand that, we have to first of all look at what are they doing. So we found 2,000 activities, assessed them across all occupations, and then within each of those activities say, well, what does that activity mean? Like to say hello to a customer. Well, you have to be able to recognize the customer. There is something about a perception. And then there has to be a cognitive, thinking process. I have to do something that says, okay, I acknowledge, should I say hello, should I not say hello? Or, and then what do I do actually? Is it a physical expression or something like that? So just a silly example saying, for every activity, there's a set of things that you have to do, and then you add all those up and you get the sum total of the activities in a given job. So that's how we think about it. We thought 18 capabilities, and I found this to be really fascinating work. So we divide everything that you do. Everything you do in your entire day can be defined in some way by these 18 capabilities. And we can argue about this, but this is the methodology. Some of it is sensory perception. There's social and emotional. Can we sense it? Do we reason about it? Can we say something about it? There is physical. Do we have to touch it? Do we have to move it? Do we have to figure out where we're going? And do we actually have to go there? Some jobs have more or less of these things. And then finally, there's cognitive. Do we have to recognize something? Do we have to figure something new out? Do we have to just simply logic our way through it? Be creative, find new data, coordinate stuff, understand language. These are all sort of cognitive experiences. And for each of those things, what we can say is, well, that's what a human has to do. And we say, and then you can measure this in terms of how fast they have to move, how quickly they have to think, how far they have to see. And they say, now let's compare median human performance to what an AI can do. How much can a robot do? And what's good or what's bad. And there you see. So the red is where robots are not so good today. Yellow is where they're okay. And green is where they're pretty good. And so you can see the gross motor skills and navigation. Yeah, robots can pretty good compared to a median human performance. Robots can do that. Other things, not so much. The logical reasoning, the creativity perhaps, some of the social and emotional. But bear in mind, again, that chart about progress and how quickly things are improving and changing. So the belief being that this is something that will change over time. And the capacity of AI to improve means all those reds will ultimately become yellows, and all those yellows will ultimately become greens. So this is a bit of, this is our snapshot. This is where we are today. It's not the movie yet. Let's take those, so then let's turn that into activities. So those are capabilities, and so we turn those things into activities. We said there's 7 broad categories of activities. There's managerial activities, there's expertise, sort of advising kind of activities, there's interfaces, there's the unpredictable physical, which is kind of interesting. This is the sort of the gardener or the landscape janitor. It's not very predictable. You don't really know where the problem is. You have to go figure it out. Collecting data, processing data, and finally predictable physical activities, which is sort of chop the tree, chop the tree, chop the tree, chop the tree. So that's a picture of an economy cut by activities. You can see the wages underneath that. It sort of shows you that there's quite a lot of wages which are in very predictable physical activities. There's quite a lot of that would be assembly line work, for example, or processing and collecting of data. Which would all be things that are done by lawyers and doctors and dentists and nurses. So it's not just your manufacturing worker that's going to be affected by this. It's sort of a lot of the activities that are being done in a rote way that have knowledge, quote, knowledge work associated with them, actually probably could be done by a machine today. Which kind of gets us to where we're going here, which is that automation, when we say, what percentage of jobs will be affected by automation, the answer is 100%. Everybody's job is going to be affected by automation. It's not a this or that. So here we have on the vertical axis is the potential. Again, this is all potential. We'll get to adoption in a minute, but this is potential. The activities that can be automated by adapting currently demonstrated technology, today's technology, right now, the snapshot. And on the horizontal, it's the wage. And so you can see that quite a lot of low wage can be automated. Some cannot, again, like the landscaping and the groundskeeping workers, where it's very unpredictable and you don't know where the problem is. But the file clerks, yeah, they can be automated right now. But everybody, some percentage of everybody's day will be automated. Even the chief executive, 30% of the chief executive's time could be automated. And I'm sure if I look at my time, 30% of it could be automated, probably more. So that, everybody's got a piece of this. And here it breaks it down by occupation. So, the 100% of the, about 5% of occupations could have 100% of their tasks automated. So there's some occupations which will probably just go. And they don't actually have so many sewing machine operators anyway right now, but assembly line workers are kind of an endangered species. Or at least the definition of what is an assembly line worker will change radically. And I can give an example of this is for bank tellers. Back in the day, bank tellers 30 years ago were basically there to count money. And so when people brought in ATMs, they assumed that bank tellers would disappear because you had an ATM and didn't need to go to count money. They didn't. In fact, they grew dramatically. So what happened? Well, the bank teller wasn't just there, decided that, okay, we're not there to just count money. We're now going to be a customer relationship manager. We're going to advise people on their financial products, and we're going to establish relationships that can help them do other things besides count money. And that coincided with a dramatic growth in the number of bank branches as well. And so they actually invested, companies and banks, because they thought people wanted this and needed this, and there was people willing to pay for this, and they would pay fees for that service. And as a result, bank tellers did not disappear, they grew. Now, bank tellers are actually starting to shrink. So it's interesting. So it just shows you that job categories might still be there, but they would probably be different jobs. It's not going to be and so we should not be so romantic about saying what a journalist is or what a doctor is. It might be a very different thing going forward when most of that person's job, as it is currently defined, can be automated. So 60% of occupations could have 30% of their tasks automated. That's kind of the baseline. We should expect that a third of whatever you're doing today will no longer be done that way or at all going forward. And 2/3 might be the same, but don't count on it either. And at the high end of it, psychiatrists and legislatures. So those jobs might look very similar, but even there, I kind of doubt it. Fashion designers. All right, adoption. That's all potential. This is a slightly confusing chart, but let's start it down at there is at 50%. The dotted lines that shows you where we are today. 50% of all activities could be automated today, and the technical, that's the technical lines, and then we have early or late. And so as it goes up, maybe I can use this. Yeah, sure this is yeah, I'm off there. Okay. Right, so this is the technical lines. This actually needs, so this says that 50% of all things could be technically automated today. And if we take an aggressive sort of view again of how fast AI will develop, and we say like 100% of the jobs that we have today by the year 2050 could technically be automated. That's kind of really aggressive. But okay, what's the latest scenario? It's 2060. That doesn't make me feel much better. So by 2060, if you believe in technological progress and how fast AI is going and improving, basically everything we do today will be different in the future. This has a real implication for education. So why are we teaching people how to do things when well within the early stages of their career, everything they've been taught is completely irrelevant because they no longer have that job. So that's the technical side. You can say, well, that's not reality, of course. Reality is that this 50% today is zero. So, which is it? Is it 50 or is it 0? So what we did was we went and we looked at adoption curves. And we say, how fast is new technology introduced and how quickly do people start to use it? And again, we've kind of got your, early versus late, so slow versus fast. And it basically says, okay, that 50% number, aggressively, we'll get there by 2040. Otherwise, maybe about 2060, 2070. So within the next 20 to 40 years, we'll get there. And what's driving that? Well, a lot of it is economics. Sometimes it just doesn't make any sense to automate. If you've got a cheap labor cost and it costs you a lot of money to build a machine to replace that person, you're not going to do that. You're going to wait until actually the economics of doing it makes sense. Back to our example of janitors and groundskeeper. That's very expensive to automate, because you actually have to build something. You've got to build a machine. You've got to build a robot that actually has steel and something, and so there's actual cost to this. And then you've got to figure out this very complicated process of how to know what's going to be cleaned and what's not going to be cleaned. And how much were you paying your janitor again? Not very much, or your groundskeeper. So does it make sense to spend $200,000 on a robot to replace a $35,000 janitor? No, nobody's going to do that. And so that job probably won't get automated, at least not for a long time. On the other hand, your dental assistant, who costs you about $65,000 and spends all their time interpreting codes for billing purposes and categorizing different kinds of operations, are they going to get, is that job possible to automate? Yeah. What does it do? What do you need to do that? You don't need anything physical. You need a scanner. You need a camera, and you need a connection to a cloud server. That's about it. And then you need an algorithm. And so that's it. Your job is done. Will that job get automated? Yeah, pretty fast. So some jobs will be easier because of the economics look better to do this. Some will take longer. And of course, there are jobs which you say, well, there's still a lot about this interaction or this particular skill that even if the AI's performance can be measured at a similar level, I still don't want it. I want the human interaction, and I'm actually willing to pay for that interaction. So there will be that's part of adoption as well. So we actually note that generations change and their desire for different kinds of interactions. All of us in this room, I'm sure most of us have kids, can say that, that the way in which younger people interact with each other is a lot more technologically enabled today than it was when we were kids as well. So it's going to take decades, but it's coming. So why do we care? this could all be a good thing, right? And we're back to the beginning of the chart. You know, we all had positives. We all had a lot of good stuff was happening in the world. Life's being extended, and the environment even gets better, and we're not killing each other quite so fast. It's because of this. That was a story of averages. And we are no longer in the world of average. Average doesn't matter anymore. The differences matter, because the differences are getting a lot bigger. This is a snapshot based of the US economy over the last 15 years. And it shows the differences between the leaders and the laggards in digitization. So back in 1997, we could call the leading sectors were 100, measured by digitization, meaning how much digital technology did that company use? How many of their transactions were online? How much did they spend on hardware and software? How much training did they do in digital areas for their workers? So that's all digitized. We saw that the leading sectors were at 100, the lagging sectors were at 8%. And then we measure progress. And what we saw was that over the next 15 years, the leading sectors increased their digitization by almost 4 times. Now, the lagging sectors improved a bit, but by nowhere near. And so what we have is this big and growing gap between the leaders and the laggards. And that's something that's an economic picture, but as we say, this also has real social implications. So if you're wondering why people are upset in OECD countries, I'll throw another number, 60% of households in OECD countries have had flat to declining household incomes over the last decade. 60%. This is the story of why averages don't matter. When the whole average is increasing, but 60% of the population is flat to declining, then we have a problem. So here's the picture of which sectors, who's going fast and who's digitizing quickly. Well, it's probably who you would expect. It's the tech companies, it's ICT, it's media. That's a really interesting one. Reflect on that for a moment. Media is perhaps one of the most digitized sectors in the world. It's professional services. So the people are lawyers and the consultants and the accountants and so forth. So it's banking. And who's at the other end? Well, of course, agriculture perhaps, you might expect that. Big sectors though, healthcare, construction, hospitality, tourism, government. I mean, so that's most of the employment. You add that up, that's actually 60% of the employment is lagging. So we ask ourselves, why don't we see computers everywhere, but our productivity still doesn't seem to be reflecting it? We know this, that productivity has been dropping. Well, this is why. It's not actually, those computers, we're using them, we're carrying them around our phones, but we're not actually using them in our offices. We're not actually changing our healthcare, or changing our hospital, our hotels. Now, the little black dots, they indicate that within that sector, there is a leading company. So there is an Airbnb within hospitality, and there are disruptors in transportation and in retail, but these are massive sectors. So this is kind of just a way of saying you haven't seen anything yet. You're just getting started here. And this is going to overtake not just one shop or 2 shops, it's basically every shop. And as you can see, like the Amazon shops in Seattle now, no people. There's no one there. You just go in, get your stuff, come out. You're tagged as you go in, you're tagged as you go out. That's it. You don't need anybody. This is kind of just the start, in other words. But it's more than just the sector picture. That's showing sectors. Here's companies. Within every sector, again, we're seeing a big divide between the established and on the high right there, you've got the big digital leaders and the laggards on the lower left. And most companies are laggards. Most companies are not getting this. And there are returns to scale for the companies that get it. They're the ones that do grow faster. They're the ones that have more profits. And as we can see, the top 10% of corporations in the United States have increased their share of profitability from about 40% of profitability to about 55% of profitability. So you used to have like 10-40. It's now 10-55, 10-60 across the US economy. And with that, just coincidentally, the number of listed companies has declined by about 20% over the last decade or two. So we're seeing a big consolidation, and digitization is one of those driving factors. Some companies can do this, some companies clearly cannot. So yeah, which ones are doing the digital haves and the have more? So while everybody has their smartphones, not everybody uses it well. Not everybody incorporates it. So the companies that have more grow faster. They have 3 times faster profit and margin growth. They have higher productivity and innovation. And here's a kicker, 2 times faster wage growth. So if you're not working for one of these companies, or if your kids are not working for one of these companies, you're going to have a problem. This is why there is a policy implication for all of this. Disruption happens, and it's all around us, but it happens at different rates for different people at different times. And it's better to be first. It's better to be the one that actually gets it, because you have bigger opportunities to capture more rent, in the economist phrases. And here's an example. So this is where the money is. You know, all of these companies, they're the ones attracting capital. So you have 176 private companies valued over $1 billion. The black ones are the ones, the darker it is, the more recent it is. So this is something that's happening sort of right now. In the last 5, 10, 15 years, AI and technological breakthroughs are leading to, multi-billion-dollar valuations for all of these things. I should also add, it's unfortunately really hard to name traditional old companies that have made this transition. How many traditional, 100-year-old companies, 50-year-old companies can you think of that has a digital valuation? It's really hard. There's not a lot of them out there. So this is not a game for everybody. And that's because of here's the final sort of depressing chart. If you were a company on this stock S&P 500, back in 1935, you probably were about 90 years old. Today, you're probably about 18, maybe 15 years old. So the average lifespan of a company has dropped by almost 80% over the last 60 or 70 years. This is the implication of what happens when you do not digitize. And you can't keep up. You don't attract capital. As we saw yesterday, Tesla's valuation is bigger than GM's right now. Some people say that, wow, that must be crazy, an incredible execution. So no, it just says that Tesla's a better company than GM. That's all that really says. It can generate more value for shareholders than GM can. And because GM is essentially a healthcare plan on wheels, that's probably not wrong. Whether Tesla's valuation is correct is another problem. But this leads you to the question, what's a company? Now, when a company can be put together by a couple of engineers and a venture capitalist and get a couple of $1 billion of valuation in a matter of months, why do we have companies? Why do we call them? They're projects. These are just projects that have gotten funding, and we call them a company. So, fascinating question. Do those companies have any responsibility to anybody other than the people that got together with their technologies, which came from somewhere else, and gathered their money, which came from somewhere else, and sold it to customers who are everywhere? And who are they responsible to? And what are they responsible for? It reminds me of a Fortune article, and this is maybe a digression, of about 20 years ago about the death of a job. And the death of a job was mooted at the point that they said the jobs were a creation of the industrial age. And they weren't around for much longer. We had jobs because we had to feed the machines. We had these big centralized machines, steam engines, boilers, the factories, and we couldn't define an individual's contribution as a product. It was no longer something you could say, this product is this individual. This person only had a piece of the whole thing. So we had to create a job, which is a set of activities, again, that this person would do. And they would clock in the morning, and they would clock out in the afternoon, and they had done their job. This is where Marx coined the theory of the alienation of labor. You were no longer close to your product. Your product was something that someone else had taken, and you just had activities. Maybe we're finally seeing the death of the job. And this is what we get. What we get is potentially good. All these projects create new products, but they also create vast inequality, dramatic disruptions across societies, where people no longer have the safety of knowing what is their job. They don't have one anymore. They have activities, perhaps, but how do those come together, and who gets the rent, who gets the value? This is going to come to you. People have, another big topic these days has been globalization. People are saying that, death of globalization. Used cross-border with 2005, this is what the world's data traffic looked like. A lot of it from the EU to North America, a little bit in Asia. 45 times growth over the last decade. If it can be digitized, it will be. There's no walls. The borders are down. They're coming across the borders, but they're digital. So this is kind of the challenge, and as you can see, Asia is a huge portion of that growth. That this wave of digitization is a global wave. And when we did our analysis saying which countries could be faster or slower in terms of this process of digitization, what we found is basically no difference. Some places at 45%, some places at 57%. Korea is in there at 50%, right after China. This is basically a function of the job mix, saying what is so technically potential same across all of these countries, and with that capacity to bring the innovation into the society, because again, people want this. They look at it and they say, this allows me to get better health care, or this saves me time. And there's a market for this stuff. But then the implication, the people providing that, some of them will make money, most of them will not. Everybody's job will change. So South Korea, this might already be a big factor. South Korea is already feeling the largest effects of across the world of slowing flow of prime age, working age population. So this is the growth in the contribution of working age population to GDP per capita, and the orange is Korea. So you see back in the 80s it was still positive, but going forward it's negative. And so that just says, some of this AI factor, the begin adoption rates, we'd expect adoption rates for Korea to be higher because not so many people. And still you need a lot of the requirements. So the economics, again, the supply-demand equation that drives whether or not we automate something, it should be accelerating the adoption rates in Korea because of the demographic factors. So potential same, acceleration possibly higher. This might be the issue. When we talk about the aristocracy of labor, we might have a very different meaning in the next 5 years, the aristocracy of robots. Some people have better ones than others. That said, as we look at kind of what's expected to grow, healthcare, social welfare services, tourism related. This is this is the sort of good government forecast, a little bit of MGI numbers. But there's a lot here about what you could be doing differently and where the jobs of the future might be to incorporate that technology. Because we know that multipliers for things like social welfare are pretty high. If you invest in social welfare jobs, you tend to get people consuming more of other things as well, including healthcare, of course, but also they go back to work, and they actually get new things to consume there, whether it's retail or housing or what have you. So the question, so in those sectors, again, how do we see technology taking place and technology developing? Final point, this all will mean what we call a new deal. Historically, business exists in a context where there's some formal expectations of business. You're regulated, you got taxes, you got some contractual responsibilities, you use IPR. That's the formal business regulation. So people sometimes say, the business of business is business. That's all it is. You regulate me and that's it. I just do that. Nothing else matters. But the formal operates within a context of the semi-formal, which are the promises, the standards, the expectations, which are not always written down. I think perhaps a very current example is the United Airlines policies on overbooking, which perhaps were legally correct, but clearly violated some idea of standards and norms and promises to your customers. And that's going to change their legal contract. I am sure that will change the way in which that contract is written, which says, of overbooking. And finally, all those norms and promises, those are in turn driven by the attitudes and the issues that are developing in society. And so as we talk about what we see now, we see a force which will change people's attitudes and will raise new issues around the workplace. And what is the meaning of work? And what's the responsibility of the employer to the worker? And what's the responsibility of the society to both the employer and the worker? One of my big things I talk about recently is the shared mobility in China and the role of Didi, which at 75% market share for shared mobility services is effectively a private monopoly. So how should we regulate Didi? Especially because their economics are unsustainable. They don't make any money. And yet they provide mobility services to hundreds of millions of people in Chinese cities and employ tens of millions of drivers. It's a completely unregulated, unprecedented situation. So we need to figure this out. And it will be figured out quickly, one way or the other. So a new deal is coming for all business. And I'll stop there. That's kind of the basic idea. I'd love to hear your reactions to that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jonathan, for your very interesting and yet equally depressing presentation. And you have posed us a lot of, thrown at us a lot of interesting questions, and I will not waste time and express my views. Instead, I will invite questions from the floor. Yes, Dr. Han?
Listening to your story, it is really fascinating, but alarming and very fearful. You mentioned that digitalization has been very rapid and unneeded. I would like to focus on the unevenness and especially digital divide issue. For example, in Korea, we have a whole bunch of small and medium enterprises, micro family businesses, whereas a globally well-known conglomerate. But those micro businesses, they don't have any ideas on the concept of digitization. So as a result, their business is lagging and depressed. Also, we see a severe rising income inequality. The largest income gap among Asia-Pacific economies, top 10% of the Korean income bracket people, their share of GDP has risen 29% to 45% in the past 2 decades. So if current digitalization is going on and early adopters and the laggards, as you said, it will cause a tremendously the income inequality again. So my question is that how we can deal with those digital divide issue and those laggards, especially in Korea, in a huge 7 million micro family businesses. It's a big problem. So I would like to hear your policy recommendation on this. And then second question, since you're based in Shanghai, I know that China has been a front runner in drone and virtual reality and so forth. I believe that Chinese might be faster than Korea's progress in digitalization, in economic development. How you compare China's status and the Korean situation in this digital economy? Thank you.
Yes, Dr. Lee.
Thank you, Dr. Bocher. I heard from you personally that you have the PhD in political science. So my question is related to political aspect of the future world, where you emphasized that digital divide, more and more unevenness, inequality like that. So in democracy, people choose their leaders. So if, as you prescribed, if more and more people are alienated from the benefit of the so-called the forced revolution, then there might be some backlash, in terms of political choice, which we have recently witnessed in the U.S. election. So, what is your opinion on this political backlash, against unevenness and inequality? Thank you.
Would you like to answer? And then we'll get another set of questions from the floor.
Okay, give it a shot. All right, thank you. Again, that was a bit of the theme of the talk, and I wanted to start, as I said, with the optimistic side, in the sense that there was a reason why all of this is happening, and that it is, and it ultimately is leading to a positive outcome, but it's also leading to a more unequal outcome. And so the politics of inequality are what all the questions, I think, are addressing here. I recently read an Economist article, reviewing an economic history work, which stated that over the last centuries, the only things that have really substantively contributed to reductions in inequality have been vast public health disasters, wars, and Great Depressions. And so those are the things that actually make us more equal. Is when everybody dies, or there's a vast transformation because of some catastrophic event. And now that's a slightly, again, depressing note to say that if that might be true at a global level, can we find any examples at a local level of positive change, of reductions in inequality? And there, I do think that there are examples. I think there are societies which have become less unequal. And even if there is inequality, that have made it more tolerable to be at the bottom end of that inequality, that it's acceptable. And this, the clearest example would be, would you rather be poor in Scandinavia or poor in the United States? You'd much rather be poor in Scandinavia. You're less likely to be incarcerated. You're likely to live 10 or 15 years longer. You're more likely to have a healthy marriage. You're less likely to be alcoholic. All these things are true, and they're not by accident. They're the result of social and economic policy designed to create a sustainable economy. So, and that didn't come across. That also did not happen by accident. It took a sustained period of organizing and in some cases violent, though not all, activities to establish those rights. Whether we were talking about Norway or Sweden or anywhere else. So, not to say that everything is going to be that way, but I think there are examples of how inequality can be addressed in a more constructive way than simply saying it's a fact of life and we should live with it. Now to the more specific issue of SMEs and how to help SMEs. I was on a panel with the mayor of Hamburg and a vice mayor and a mayor of the deputy prime minister of Singapore, and we were talking about smart cities and technology and how it could be used by older people. And the Hamburg vice mayor said, well, of course we understand that older people, they're not as able to understand technology, so we need to leave some human interaction. So, in every government office or in every bank, we'll still have a human person, so that the old person can still find a human person and they can go talk to the human person when they don't understand what they're supposed to do. And so I asked the Singaporeans, is that your approach? And the Singaporeans said, no, of course not. Our idea is that no old person should be left behind. Every old person should be able to use technology. And if they don't understand it, we'll find a young person, and the young person will sit right next to them and teach them how to use the technology. But everybody is going to use this technology, we assure you. And you'll be surprised at how many old people are very good at social media and follow their young people around, and how surprised the young people are to know that the old people are right next to them. Yes, I think there's a different approach here. So there's certainly some need for a safety net, and some enterprises will need help, but we should not change our expectations. And so that everybody needs to participate. Opting out of a digital society is not an option. That is almost giving up, in a sense, on an entire, in this case, population. Because SMEs are simply population; they're just people, and they're individuals. So I think it's a combination of a bit of help and a bit of perhaps okay, if you need a connection or you need a system, fine, we'll figure out a way of providing you some startup capital.
but it's a lot more about information and more importantly about education. I think this is the thing for Korea. As I understand, Korea spends almost the least on vocational education of any of the OECD countries. There's very little spending on anything related to education after the age of, I don't know, 24. So we have an educational system where 85% of what you're spending is done by the age of 24. And we're saying that everything you learn in school is going to be irrelevant in 10 years. So what happens? I mean, so do we give up? Do our brain just stop or something? No, these are good investments. And they're good investments for the private and the public sector. I would say that an investment in education, an investment in training, an investment that links that to the job. That's really important. A lot of times the educational investment is done by the educator, has nothing to do with the employer. And most employers would say what they get from the educator is not very helpful. The product of the educator isn't really useful. I mean, it's there, but the employer, have to do a lot of things to develop that so-called blank sheet of paper that came out of university or whatever. So connecting the educator to the employer in a pipeline, in a much more integrated fashion, would be another policy opportunity here, which can be done through certificate programs, through licensing, obviously through part-time work and part-time education, through involving the corporations and the SMEs in the educators' work on a daily basis. Historically, the Germans, of course, are always given as an example of the apprenticeship model and how that works. And it's, every country, however, will have its own approach here, but the basic idea being that we have to substantially increase the level of investment in vocationally related education is a prerequisite for this. And then finally, in terms of China versus Korea, well, I mean, I'm a bit at a disadvantage when it comes to talking about Korea. So I'd leave you to perhaps just draw a benchmark with China. But the thing to remember about the Chinese context, of course, is that we're still only halfway through the Chinese urbanization transition. And there's only 700 million people living in Chinese cities. And there will be another 300 or 400 million people living in Chinese cities within the next 20 years. That's 300 or 400 million people who are coming straight from an agricultural environment to a post-industrial society. And we have no idea what that's going to look like. Neither do they. And so that, in some ways, is a benefit for them. They have no expectations. They show up in the city from day one and they say, teach me. I'm ready to do anything. I don't have any industrial background. My agricultural background is irrelevant. I'm 19 years old. I'm willing to learn, and I'm willing to work for free. So that's what China has going for it right now. It's got hundreds of millions of people who are moving in with high expectations of opportunities and with relatively little requirements in terms of what they personally expect in the short term. And yeah, the Chinese government is basically running to keep up. It's trying to keep up with this big wave of expectations. Expectations from the people who are already in cities, the middle class of China. They want to have higher incomes. They want to have better educations for their kids. And to meet the physical requirements of this new wave of urbanized migrants. All of that creates a very high productivity society. I should say high growth in productivity society. It's a society which is improving itself very quickly. So we cannot really compare one to another because we lose the best of both. So Korea has many, has great resources, has great companies, has great histories. What China has is growth. China has is the opportunities and the belief in its potential. And so because of that, when we look at things like digital, we look at adoption curves in China, where most countries have an adoption curve that looks somewhat, like this, it rises, but it's reasonable. The Chinese adoption curve tends to look like that. It tends to look very vertical, whether it's mobility or e-commerce or messaging. I'm not sure, how many people here I have both WeChat and WhatsApp on both of my phones, one of which is Samsung, one of which is Apple. So I can tell you that WeChat's a better system. It has more features. It has more capabilities. You can pay. You can communicate. You can plan your travel. You can go. So lots more capacity, and that I think is a benefit of the Chinese context, is that they're willing to try new stuff. Then beyond that, I would say that every society has the capacity to innovate. That's nothing that we should, again, hold back. And again, one of the most, again, back to our beginning about the Nordics, the Scandinavian countries, with all of that support, and for a social system, still one of the most innovative countries in the world, regions in the world, with some of the best companies and the most global companies. And actually the fastest growing part of Europe today is all of the Nordics. And that's not just because of migration, though that's true, but it's also the population is growing faster there, which says something.
Yes, Dr. Lee?
I have a question about labor compensation and taxation down the road. Suppose things progress as you just showed, and say 80-90% of the jobs and also the activities get automated. Then what do workers actually do in the future? Do they just spend like 2 or 3 hours checking out whether the robots are working properly, whether some uneducated human beings are messing up the system and so on, and maybe spend the rest of the time working on their poetry, painting, and all that? And if that's the case, how do you pay the workers for what they have done? And what's the basis for taxation?
Yeah.
Any other? Yes.
Thank you, Dr. Watzel, for your excellent presentation. I have a question relating to what you just answered about between China and Korea. R&D-wise, and China is spending a lot of money into it, and also China has a lot bigger population than Korea does. So in the future, it's becoming more and more difficult to find economic R&D-wise advantage. And also from the chart you showed us, I'm noticing that there is no unicorn corporation from Korea, but there are several corporations from China included in there. So what would be the intelligent strategy for Korea to found the unicorn corporation, and also how can we have a competitive edge on competing against China. By living in China, I'm noticing that as China develops, Chinese government is becoming more and more protective about Chinese market. So I would like to find a strategy that how we can survive as a country.
Do I see any other hand? Well, I'd like to invite a question from the media, because as you said, media is on the verge of very high automation. I'm sure people from the media will be very restless about that. Can I invite a question from Mr. Park? You can do it in Korean. We have a translator. Media people, you must be having sleepless nights these days.
상당히 강의 잘 들었습니다. 한국어로 하겠습니다. 지금 미디어에서는 로봇이 기자들의 일을 언제쯤 어떤 형식으로 대체할 것인가 최대 관심사입니다. 박사님의 의견을 듣고 싶습니다.
And one more question from my side. Well, pretty soon everything will be digitized. then the cybersecurity will be a very big issue. It will present us many opportunities and equally many risks. Where are we as far as cybersecurity is concerned?
Great, great questions. What is work? How do we pay for it? I think that there's been a lot of, as you said, forecasts about a society of abundance, where nobody's going to have to work anymore, we'll have money for everybody. That's not the history of humanity. The history of humanity is inequality and the inability to justly distribute whatever we think is essential to life. So I'd still be much more worried about distribution than I am about problems of abundance. Which kind of gets you to that issue of universal basic income, and are we providing stipends for everybody at all times, and how does one sort of motivate people if everything is taken care of? I think it's kind of solving the wrong problem, basically. That a lot of the harmful consequences of not having income are pretty visible. It's called homelessness and drug addiction and crime rates. So these things tend to be addressed by every society at the point where they become unbearable, and they provide their funds are made available to deal with them, in line with the social attitudes and consensus of that society. And it's very different in different parts of the world. But you do have a good point about if we have a compensation system that is based on hours. And if we no longer have any more hours, how do we compensate people? We don't need, and that is an interesting question. That is what the market is there to decide. And I think the short answer to your question is that we said this was a snapshot based on today's jobs. So tomorrow's jobs are going to incorporate those automation capabilities. We're going to have jobs that have augmented human capabilities, the human plus machine. So that is, I was with Mitch Kapoor, who's the founder of Lotus 123, and he said, there's two kinds of AI. There's the AI which makes us all better, faster, stronger, smarter, and then there's the AI which is, bow down to your robot overlords. So, and the first kind is absolutely happening. That is just making everybody in this room much more capable and much more productive. So who knows what they're going to do with it? Do you know what the fastest growing occupation in the United States Census has been for the last 20 years? The fastest growing category? It's kind of a trick question. It's other. Others have been the fastest growing category, job category in the U.S. Census, because people have no idea what to call it. What is that barista cum, video game designer slash, I don't know, some kind of artist person. So what is that job? So sooner or later people do create categories, and they say, oh, that's what that category is, and now that category will grow faster, and we can make our projections. But really, we don't know. Nobody could have predicted that Angry Birds would be a big industry. So that we'll see. But I guess it comes back to this question. Ultimately, a job is what people are willing to pay for. They're willing to provide some measure of recognition and of exchange, and that is actually a very fundamental human need, to be valued for your contribution. And that, I think, is the real question: is how do we let people know that they're valued and they're part of society, and their contribution is recognized, which is wholly separate from the question about how big a house should they have, or whether they should be allowed to take 10 vacation days a year or 30 vacation days a year. I mean, that's a different conversation. But to allow people to know that their contribution is recognized and valued, and that they're a part of society, that I think is actually the real debate that will come on. And so I have no doubt that somehow we are going to maintain a monetary system of compensation for some people. I just don't know what they're going to be doing. To Korea versus China, R&D and the unicorns. Well, of course, just bear in mind that 30 years ago, China was 1.1 or 0.9, 1 billion very poor people with no companies. There was nothing. And it's well within memory of this population, most people in this room, that Korea was actually kind of the same, 1950s, and China by the 1980s was kind of, that's what China looked like. So this is all very new. But when 1.3 billion people stand up, you should expect things to change. And so yes, I would not be trying to compete across the board with China, or as I would not be trying to compete with the United States for that matter. I would be always looking at what is my source of competitive advantage, and what's going to make, what can we build on, what is our core strengths and our distinctive assets, and from that, how do we turn that into a global capacity? And clearly, Korea has many of those things. And the obvious one is human capital, literacy rates, their capacity to develop, to learn new things. Those would be the areas where you hopefully build more. If we look at the most successful Korean exporters, they tend to be there's certainly hardware, but a lot of it is software. If you ask people in China, what do they know about Korea? They do know Samsung, but they know K-pop a lot more. And so the characters, the software, the storytelling, I actually feel like that's going to be the more sustainable aspect of it. Because what does it take to move an LED plant? All you need is a road and a decent, power supply, and some people who work for relatively little to do some aspect of it. The R&D component of it aside, everything else is very movable. So that becomes a real question. So, like, to what extent does the economy still rely on fixed capital investments that are essentially legacy and are working down their incumbent base, and to what extent do we start to reinvest in new services with leveraging human capital? Would be my personal thought. And then finally on media, well, as you can see, I think in fact it's already happening. That you can easily get news services today. 50% of what Reuters or AFP or whatever puts out is written by AI. It's people who just pulling in the latest set of commodity prices or stock market movements and stringing together a couple of paragraphs and you're done. That actually doesn't need any human intervention at all. And that can be extended into video, into interviews even. So a lot of this can be done by remote. So where will the jobs be? Well, the jobs again will be where people are willing to pay for them. And that, I think we've discovered that the media has a vast capacity to find things that people are willing to pay for, including, of course, analytics. And so the creativity of the analytics sector of media is underestimated. I think that we've seen the results in recent elections of how to understand and interpret data, how to really get underneath why people are saying what they're doing, why do they react a certain way to a certain type of content. What is the implication of that for their purchasing, let alone for their voting? I think that's a growth sector. So again, you couldn't do that without big data. So media that is able to use big data, that is able to provide therefore a service to, in this case, advertisers, to say, okay, let's really understand your market segments through their media purchasing patterns and their reactions and their own activities. And to go beyond that, to right into their daily lives through IoT, again, through tracking and through providing, a very updated version of Nielsen. There's a lot of opportunity here, and it's an area where I think a lot of investments will be made by the private sector. But ultimately, it comes to your last point about cybersecurity. I think that everything we've heard about the capacity for monitoring across the across the internet, and the fact that your life is an open book wherever you are, is simply a precursor to a vast investment in privacy. And there will be a tremendous opportunity here to invest in everything from screening to privacy software to encryption capacities. That market is going to take off. And everybody has all of a sudden realized that we've half a step behind the hackers, and so we just need to get the hackers to start turning themselves into cybersecurity experts, and that will be a big opportunity for media as well. So anyway, it's very. I hope these are sort of directionally correct. I have to say, again, my background is as a political scientist, as you mentioned, and as an urbanist by inclination. So I view these things in the context of an ecosystem, something that you have actions and you have reactions. You have all sorts of stakeholders. So it's not you can have snapshots, but you should pay attention to the movie. And the movie is driven ultimately by everybody, and all of us in this room, and all of us outside of this room.
Okay, can I invite one more question before I invite Dr. Sagong for his question and wrap-up comment? Anyone? Yes, in the back.
I'm sorry, I missed your first part of presentation, so you might already cover my question. So these days, it's election time in Korea, so all president candidate is forced to answer or present the policy response to the fourth industrial revolution. I think there might be some relevant, some level of cooperation between the government and private sector. So my question is, who takes the driver's seat? And then my second question is optional. So all professional jobs will be in danger over this cost of transformation. So how about the McKinsey itself? How do you respond to this automation and the replacement of potential professional jobs in McKinsey as a professional consultant? Thank you.
Sure. So I got the first one. It's government versus private sector, and who takes the lead in these Industry 4.0 conversations. If I understood it right, and I guess I think obviously that every company is trying to make its own investments, given what is happening in its own industries. And so whether it sees an opportunity for growth or for productivity improvements, and that it's hard to say that any individual company can have a society-shaping impact, though. As a class, of course, I think the private sector is the source of innovation, and that's where we expect to see new businesses and business models. And as we said, the impacts of these on the workplace are going to be fundamental. And so these new platforms, whether job sharing and shared mobility, or they're now creating a new work environment where I think our number was something like 25% of the working population in the United States is on independent work now through these platforms, which are essentially unregulated. So the benefits and all that they're not defined for those workers. So I think there is individual companies will be the source of innovation as a class. They will be the ones that create the issues. And then you have government as the representative of all stakeholders, or as the place where you're supposed to see the debate, have to respond. And that's on this chart actually is kind of, the reason I like it is because the companies there are these disruptors who are outside, who are creating these issues, and then they have to be translated into impacts on people, which create these standards and norms and promises. So I promise to provide this, and that debate is what government should be mediating. That's the role of government. We need private sector to take risk, to try new things, to develop new ideas. We need government to allow us to agree on what is an appropriate standard. What's the promise that we make to the consumer and to the employee? I think those are two different conversations, but both very important. I'm not being as familiar with any of Korean politics at this point. I'll stay out of the rest of that question. But on your question about McKinsey, sure. 70% of what we do today is not what we did 15 years ago. 15 years ago, we were very much viewed as a strategy firm. Today, we're viewed as a firm that partners with our clients to change them. And that means everything from big data analytics to management, organizational change, and behavioral psychology to product design. All of which is enabled through new capabilities which didn't exist before. They didn't have those things in the marketplace. We couldn't be good at them because they didn't exist. Now we try to become better, and that's our story. And I think that's the story of most firms around the world, is that they have to be less romantic about who they were, and sort of more, hopefully, visionary, but at least optimistic and committed to who they can be, and take advantage of those resources and skills that are now available.
Last
question.
yes.
You must have not replaced all these 70% of these people who are involved in new business for the past 15 years. What did you do about this?
I wouldn't recommend the McKinsey model for most people, because I think it's organizations are specific, but I will just say that McKinsey is a learning institution. And so as we continue to learn, People grow, and when they stop learning, then they go.
Scary. Okay, lastly, Chairman Sago.
Yeah, I just found out that it's much better sitting here and listening and enjoying listening than sitting up there. But anyway, since you live in China, I think you must have a very useful observation on the role of the labor union. In this whole process of automation and disappearing jobs, and what functions the service or disservice can be provided by the labor unions, particularly in China now. Fortunately or unfortunately, there are no labor unions, strong, radical labor unions, unlike Korea. So, protecting workers are different from protecting jobs. So, as you said, Chinese adaptation to new technology is just very, very fast, much faster than Korea. I suppose that has something to do with labor union as well. If labor union keep insisting on protecting existing jobs, as some of the Korean labor unions are still trying to do, then this automation or the job displacement, replacement can be delayed and can be affected. So what's your observation on this labor union, the role of labor union, factor of labor union in the process?
As Dr. Yeo knows, that's a very sensitive question. So I can do my best to try to address it, but again, I speak from the Chinese context, where, as you say, labor unions are not independent actors. They are part of the government. They are responsible to, I think, formally speaking, all heads of unions have to have Communist Party leadership involved. But they provide in the case of China, a set of promises to their members around conditions of employment, safety in the workplace, the right to employment, the process whereby people can be hired or fired. Those are the ways in which the labor union is responsible. But a more fundamental of China, a more fundamental labor policy issue in China is the labor law itself, which governs, again, the amount of time you can take off for different holidays, for maternity or paternity leave, or the firing process itself and arbitration. Those things are all governed by one national labor law. And the unions do not play a specific role in that. The unions are much more of a, if you will, like a on-the-job counseling role, not a legal and advocacy role. At least they haven't seen that so far. And that's the system they've got. I sense that Chinese system has, as you say, been flexible to allow for very high rates of job turnover. And so if we look in, typically in the Pearl, I always think of the Pearl River Delta as being the laboratory for China. And if you had a table like this of factory managers, they would ask each other, what's your number? And it was like 5 or 7, 9. So what is that number? That number is the number of weeks it takes to turn over the entire factory workforce. So within 8 weeks, the entire workforce is gone, and a new workforce is there. So the Chinese labor law allows that to happen. It allows, so that is the flexibility that we have, and it's very, as a result, we have therefore 15% growth in productivity in Chinese factories over the last 2 decades, which is partially due to that high rate of turnover. It's roughly a 40% turnover in Chinese manufacturing every year across the entire country. So yeah, all of that's to say, I mean, this is a country in China is in catch-up. So it's changing fast because it knows it can. It knows that there is an opportunity, there is a better factory, there is a better thing to be done, so people are confident. They're saying, yeah, I'll take the chance, I'll leave because there's something I'm going to. I can see the opportunity. Societies that lose that confidence, they slow down a lot. And that metabolic rate is a concern. The United States' manufacturing turnover is about 15%. So the way of saying the Chinese labor speed or metabolic rate is 2.5 times that of the United States. And people are in front in races because they run faster. So if Korea wants to run faster, it needs to speed up. That's the only way to do it.
Okay, any final comment, Chairman Sangho?
No, I think,
Okay.
well, as I said again, I enjoyed very much listening here and sitting here and listening to you. And, well, it's fascinating and a lot of things are changing. Since McKinsey is forefront of all this happening, so we appreciate very much your observation and the very illuminative Thank you very much. Yes.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Jonathan Watson, for your very interesting presentation and discussion and engagement with the floor. And thank you, participants, for your very active discussion and engagement. Thank you.